Just wanted to apologize to you for interrupting you in our last little discussion because I saw in the comments people were falling asleep, and I thought if we had a disagreement over a particular topic, then it might wake them up. And after that, I was looking at the comments. I didn't see anything, I mean, other than the fact that the Avro Arrow was, in fact, one of the finest flying machines in the late 1950s, far superior to anything else. And my knowledge of it, because I knew somebody that actually worked on that project, and he gave me the inside track on what actually happened to the thing. And like he said, the U.S. military was sitting there with their transport planes, tons of tractor trailers, all of the CIA, FBI guys there blocking people off not to get onto the facility. And they cleaned everything out. He said when he walked into his office, everything was gone. And he was the head accountant for the project. All the employee files, everything else was gone. And he did say that there was a few drawings that some of the architects and the drafting people, they said they did some of their work at home. They still had a few of their architectural drawings of that machine.
Now, I was just going to ask, because I didn't at the time, what year was this happening, that they took all those planes and the staff away?
End of 58, I think.
End of 58. Okay. Yeah. Now, what's the Avro plane, that circular one that we've seen pictures of?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. The Avro Arrow was the wedge-shaped wing design, and it had rectangular intakes for the engine, which, if you look at the new F-22 Raptor, it's basically the same machine.
Okay. That was the plane I was talking about. That's the sled driver. I was just using that as an example of what was being done at the time of Apollo, because the SR-71 was being developed at the same time by probably much the same people, because it was Lockheed who built the SR-71. They started in early 1960s.
See, when the Avro Arrow, when they shut down the program, and they were basically being told that as a united fighting force between US and Canada, the technology had to match. Like for them to fight together, they needed to have the same technology. Those engine designs, everything else, and the engineers that were doing that all went to work in the United States.
Interesting.
You know something, Noel, I thought was interesting, that what Randy said during the live that we had? He made a point about the LRO photos. Now, when I was doing the second video for him, Richard Cox was hosting the show on Randy's live debate with Justin Cox. And he was making a point that he said, I've seen a lot of LRO images. And this is Randy, when Randy's speaking now. And he said, I've seen a lot of these images where they've shown photographs of the moon's surface, the hills, the mountains, the craters, and things like that. And he says, why can you see everything so clearly? But then when you take the LRO photos and look at those, and I'm talking about the new ones, not the ones that were taken in 97. I'm talking about the ones that were taken in 2000. And all you can see is this fuzzy thing, but you can't identify it. But you can see all the tracks, the boot prints, and the rover track. For some reason, they're crystal clear. And this was a point that Richard Cox was also bringing out. You know, he says, that's baffled me for a long time, because you can see all these beautiful hills and they're well defined. Mind you, they're supposedly, a mile up or half a mile up. But the point is that you can still see the lunar surface beside them. And it's very pristine. And yet, when we look at any of those LRO images, you can see everything crystal clear, the tracks, everything. The prints, all the tracks they're making, but then you go and you look at the equipment that they have to stick a flag by to know what it is, and then you take a look at the rover, they have to put a flag by it so you know what it is. Then you look at the LEM that's sitting there, and it's just a blob. And these guys in the comment section were saying, oh, well, that's because you guys are looking at the low-resolution photos. Oh, no. We're looking at the high-resolution photo, supposedly, that when the LRO, they dropped it down lower, and they took more pristine photos of it. So I was looking through them this morning, And I'm going, oh, wow, this is much clearer. Yes, the tracks are clearer, but the LEM is still a blur. And everything else on the lunar surface is very well defined, except for the LEM. So
Yep.
what's up with that? And even Richard Cox was asking that question.
I've never seen a picture of the LEM on the surface in the LRO pictures. Oh, by the way, they were taken in 2009. And I've never seen one that has any clear image of the lander. There's a big arrow pointing at it saying lander or whatever, but there's no clear image of it.
And then they were talking about the Chinese and the Japanese. When I was looking at the comments this morning, and
Yep.
the Chinese and Japanese, well, that's interesting because one fellow was claiming that Raza Vihari said that China did show photos of these LRO images. I can't find them, and I don't ever recall Raza saying that.
Raza said they'd found traces of Apollo. They didn't say anything more than that. Traces of Apollo. Now, that could well be some of the rockets that crashed onto the surface, and they would be unmanned. But they were trying not to antagonize NASA by saying that they had seen it. The Chinese have never produced any photographs that they took of the landers, and nor have the Indian Space Agency have not produced any photographs officially, and nor have the Japanese.
So I thought Vikram was the one that took that photo of that three-legged something that was laying there.
Yes, that's not an Apollo lander. That's more than likely going to be the Surveyor craft, which is an unmanned craft which did land on the moon. And that's been examined by Jarrah White very extensively. And he confirms that it is a Surveyor, not an Apollo.
Well, that's interesting because I took that photo and I put it in my editor. And I started spinning it around, blowing up and spinning it around and cleaning it up. But by the time I got it way the heck over, it was about 3/4 of the way rotated. Yeah. Now it looks like the LEM. But there's a problem. There's literally one little piece missing. Yeah. So it still doesn't match.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't match. The Surveyor craft did have 3 legs. And the Indian Space Agency, Indian Space Organization, have never produced an official photograph. That 3-legged craft came from a PowerPoint presentation shown online, and somebody took a screenshot of it. But the Indian Space Agency have never officially issued a photograph.
And yet Wikipedia says that that came from the Chandrayaan-2 probe.
I still think that any of those shots that they've been using have been recreated and simulated either here or in a studio or whatever, or done off their big plaster maps.
Yeah, but look at this. Look how simple it is to make an LRO image. I've shown that many times, and I've shown it again. And all you have to do is go to any of the craft that have the camera out the window when they're taking off. And as soon as it tips down, you'd go, snap, there you go, blow it up, clean it up. Oh, by the way, you have to turn it into a black and white because they didn't have enough money to send a color camera on the LRO this time. And here's another point that they were making in the debate, and I believe Richard Cox mentioned this, but he said, why is it that we can get such clean and pristine images from his Google Maps? He says, I could see my car in my yard. And we're not talking about taken from a helicopter. Yeah, they do use some taking from way up there in the helicopter. Then they mold it in with the satellite images. So you can still see the house before they go down lower and grab the helicopter image. You can still see that there's something in his driveway. But now they have satellites that can take, I think it's 4 pixels wide now. It's military. It's just crazy what they can get. But back in those days, you could still obtain really good photographs from the GeoEye satellite. And we've seen it with the London Eye. So you can't tell me these guys in 2009, you can't tell me that they didn't have a proper camera on that craft. It makes no sense to me, right? And this is what Richard Cox was saying. And he's a pro-NASA fan, I believe.
There's some good points that Randy made on that. I think it's becoming clear that the LRO pictures are not persuasive, to say the least. And as you've shown, it's very easy to create that sort of image if you want to blur it up a bit and make it look a bit sort of decrepit.
But just imagine this. If you were to get the original film that was in the window of the LM as it was being yanked up on a crane, because that's what was going on. I mean, when I look at the Apollo 11 footage, it's the worst. It just rocks. And by the way, it has a rhythm. You're only going to get that on a wire. You're not going to get that by firing a retro this way and then kicking it the other, firing it, kicking it, firing it. Eventually, it's going to come to a stop pretty darn fast. You can't do that with a wire or a cable. It's going to just keep rocking until it finally stops. And it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, it is. It's a good point.
What you said about that is because they're not independent. They're coming from NASA. Well, that's the same thing when it comes to the moon rock. NASA is going to claim that the moon rock has these particular markers in it. Then they send them the samples with those particular markers in it. They do the testing, find it, and say, oh, we've confirmed it.
But those moon rocks look very volcanic to me, the way they have the pits in them. You know, the holes, those tiny little holes. It looks like pumice.
Yes, most of them do look like that. It's supposed to look like volcanic rock because the narrative states that the moon was volcanic in its distant past. So, of course, they're going to produce volcanic rock. But we don't know that they were volcanic.
Well, does your rock have pits in it?
Yeah, I'll show you.
And the other thing is when they're talking about the impact and creating glass shards, volcanic rock hitting the water does exactly that as well, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right, too.
Yeah, it almost looks a little bit like Christmas cake, too, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's very similar to a lot of the moon rocks on show. Yeah,
the other side.
Got raisins, pecans, and what do you got? Dried cherries in there?
It's got almonds in it.
Oh, there's the holes.
Yeah, there they are.
You see them there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, look at that.
We'll have to confirm that that is a moon rock.
It's definitely a piece of moon rock.
And all you have to do is wait for somebody to independently go to the moon to confirm it.
Yeah.
Well, we just have to send it to McToon.
That's a piece of granite from the Giza Plateau.
There's no holes in it.
Exactly. Granite doesn't have holes in it. And there's the moon rock. They're quite different. That black mark there, by the way, is what happens when you put Brown's gas generator to melt granite. That's what it does. If you put oxyacetylene torch onto granite, it'll explode it because all the constituent parts of the granite heat up at different rates. And if some get hotter and bigger than others, it will explode. But by putting Brown's gas on it, it melted it, which is quite unusual.
You know, another thing I find interesting is that not a space agency, he sent in this article, this PDF article here, and it was called Instrumented Aircraft Visits to Honeysuckle Creek for Apollo. Well, let's just have a look and see what that instrumented aircraft actually was. Now, this is what it says. The first visit by Goddard Space Flight Center instrumented aircraft, which was a Lockheed C-121G Super Constellation, which was named NASA 421, to fly engineering tests with Honeysuckle Creek, HSK, occurred on January 9, 1967. The aircraft based out of Sydney. Reports show test flights were performed on the 9th to the 16th, and it was scrubbed on the 17th and 23rd due to weather.
What they did, if you read some of the other documentation, when they're setting up the communication, they actually had planes in the air to test their communication and the relay. And they actually put time delays in it on how they were recording it, everything else.
Yeah, but this is interesting because it says the final instrumented aircraft visit for the year was during November 14th to 28th, 1968, for the purpose of conducting simulations for the Apollo 8 mission.
Apollo 8?
You have a plane that is sending a signal out so they can receive it. So you have an audio and video signal coming out from a plane to simulate to see how that machine's going to work, how it's going to record it.
Bendix simulation. That's what this was all about.
Maybe they were using it, sending it up to the Tetra A satellite.
No, they're sending it from a plane down to their ground station to see how the signal works.
Could be. because they were doing it prior to Apollo 8. If this was 67, Apollo 8 was December 68. If this was 67, they were doing a bit of practicing just after Apollo 1 fire. That was January 67.
See, the Bendix Technical Journal is actually about the LSEP and the scientific voice on the moon, the laser ranging and human engineering design criteria, the charged particle lunar environment experiment. This is all basically what the Bendix Journal is showing here. But this other one for Apollo 8 seems to have an actual container, but then it stops. It doesn't go any further.
So what were they doing at Honeysuckle Creek?
They're receiving information that's being sent to them by planes flying by.
All right.
But what's this container, though?
That's how they practice the simulations with it.
But a container?
A container may just have referred to the box in which it was all contained. Possible.
So many files to look at. It's just
extraordinary.
You need an entire team that did nothing but look at the nonsense and updates.
But interesting, though, they have a Bendix simulation team, but they actually have a team that's just set aside for this. On every one of the missions, it goes from Apollo 8 right down to 17.
Well, you see, if it's at Honeysuckle Creek, they're going to have to test that equipment to make sure it can receive a signal, both audio and video. Now, if they actually use the simulation as a final result, because they weren't going anywhere, they could have actually put other planes up with pre-recorded stuff and just sent it to them, right?
Could have done, yep.
Oh, easily.
There's no mention of Apollo 13 here. It's interesting. 1970, only one trip to Honeysuckle Creek was recorded for this year with the instrumented aircraft NASA 421.
It says the instrumented aircraft used at Honeysuckle Creek Tracking Station during Apollo 11 to 17. The aircraft was used to ensure continuous communication with the Apollo spacecraft when it was out of range of ground-based tracking stations. This was particularly important during the handover periods when the spacecraft moved between different ground stations' coverage areas.
So the plane's going to pick this signal up from an Apollo mission?
That's right.
And relay it. That's interesting.
Right.
What kind of a dish on an airplane is going to be able to lock onto a digital signal?
Well, we're talking about Honeysuckle's dish going to lock onto the plane. But it said here, the role in Apollo missions. The aircraft played a crucial role in ensuring that telemetry, voice communications, and other data were reliably transmitted to Mission Control in Houston. This was particularly important in the early ages of the Apollo missions, as well as during re-entry when maintaining contact was critical. So this was a relaying plane, just like the ships that were relaying the message. But this is interesting because they're picking up the signal from the LM and then relaying that to Mission Control in Houston.
I read that before on how they were relaying it when they were practicing as well to make sure the signal would go across, and it was done by a series of aircraft.
Well, they must have had quite a few to get back to Houston.
Yeah.
It's a long way between Australia and Texas.
Come into California.
Yeah, come to California. It's still a long way.
Yeah, well, you see where the relay stations were in California coming through, they needed the planes to guarantee that signal coming across. And they also needed the relay when they were working with Hawaii as well. But no way a plane's going to be picking anything up from the moon.
I mean, how can a plane pick up a signal from the moon when Honeysuckle Creek had a massive dish out there to receive signals? So where was Honeysuckle Creek receiving these signals from then? Let's take a look at Houston, for example. If you need an entire array of dishes to receive a signal from the lunar surface or from lunar orbit, how on earth, then, could an aircraft flying at, say, 30,000 feet receive a signal with a tiny little dish that would have to be mounted outside the craft and then continually on a motor or servo to track it? And we're only talking how many watts that's coming from the lunar surface? There's supposed to be, 2 watts, 24 watts? I don't know. Depends on what you read. So how is that airplane going to pick this up with a tiny little dish, and yet you need a whole array of dishes at Houston to pick the same signal up?
So to do a simulation, if you have all of these people doing the relay from one ground station to another using aircraft to relay the signal, To create that simulation, you only need to have one aircraft that's sending the signal to Honeysuckle, and then the rest of them are relaying them out.
Well, that makes more sense.
I had read before with them doing simulations using the aircraft, and they even put in that 1.2 second delay in there. They were practicing that, the delay. Why do you need to practice the delay? Because you're going to use that final information as a full simulation. Now, what Houston's looking at is a signal that's coming in from their known source, which is where they claim that signal is coming from, and saying it's the actual image. And all those people sitting behind that control panel at Houston is sitting there going, oh, look, turn the camera on. It came on upside down. Oh, turn the TV camera around. Okay, now it's right side up. Here comes Neil. One small step. And they still do it today. They have no idea where that signal's coming from. None of them. They think it's the real thing. All that's pre-recorded, just being relayed.
If that's a simulation, where's the signal coming from? Probably that Tetra satellite.
They could use another ground station, send it up to one aircraft, and then back down again. Just use an aircraft. They don't need to have satellites or anything else. They got all the aircraft there to do the simulation.
Let's say it was coming from that Tetra satellite, that testing and training satellite. That would make more sense.
Yeah, or you could relay it through a bunch of aircraft too, right? It's like when I started to see that the simulation had to include that delay from the signal 1.2 to the moon and 1.2 back, right? 2.4 second delay. And they're using multiple aircraft to relay the signal around. They could have it broadcasting from anywhere, from any radio television station on the ground up to any aircraft, and then relay it around a bunch and bring it back.
Just interesting why they chose Honeysuckle.
They had to have stuff so it looked like when you're orbiting around the Earth that you've got communications all the way around.
Well, they would have to be at key points on the Earth's surface. Well, they'd had the ships. I mean, how many relay ships did they have?
See, and the stuff in Alaska is for the communication up there was for the re-entry. The way it was supposed to come back into the Earth, right? That's the re-entry to Hawaii. And Alaska was using that path. And that path was designed so that Alaska got the same kind of funding that the rest of the United States got. They spread that money out. That's part of how the path comes in.
Yeah.
We got to fund these people up there. They need something to do. So they put the return communications up there.
The aircraft visited Honeysuckle Creek on April 12th to 20th, 1969 for Apollo 10 and 11 simulations. The routing of the aircraft for this mission was unusual in that it was via Alaska, Japan, and the Philippines. So there's a link with Alaska already. Interesting document, this one.
When you really start to look at the details and the risk that's involved there and what should have been in place for those astronauts, you take a look at Apollo 11, how Neil's first 20 minutes when he's describing the surface and stuff like that, they went from that to Apollo 12, where they're knocking the camera down, knocking over pieces of equipment, joking around, being idiots, falling down on their knees, everything, They weren't taking it seriously. Neil was a very different character. He was much more professional in his job. I think more of a very quiet family man at best when it comes to that. But all the rest of the characters were just horsing around on the set. Look what Alan Bean's doing with his little sketches and stuff. They're putting that all together. That would never happen. None of that stuff would happen. Not when your life is at risk. And you're doing it for the first time. Everything is for the first time.
Allegedly.
Yeah, but if they actually were there, everything is the first time.
They would take extreme care over it. I mean, every footstep would be thought about in advance, because how do they know that the ground was solid enough to support their weight?
They wouldn't know if there was a little fissure or crack in there that's just covered over with dirt. Imagine if they broke their leg.
Yeah.
What about lunar quicksand? That's what they thought they were going to encounter, which I believe that's why Neil had himself tethered off to the limb. I mean, let's face it, they still could have done that outside underneath that big crane. They could have. They could have done everything there because they had all the craters. Another thing that was interesting, too, is that they had, I believe, 3 different crater sites. They had the one underneath that crane. They had another one up further to the, let's see what would be, that would be the east, and then they had one further down to the west. So there were 3 crater pits. They could have moved that LEM anywhere in that area because you're going to have to get different scenery. So if you have 3 different locations, you can move it this way and turn it this way, and you can make the craters look all different. Mix them up. Maybe that's where it was, and maybe there was quicksand there. Maybe that's why he got tethered off.
And there's nobody to rescue you on the moon, is there?
When you're talking about that, that would kind of belay running around on a rover, wouldn't it? Because now you're traveling across at speed, and all of a sudden you hit a big and you're gone.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Where's the tether for the rover?
If there was that kind of thing happening there, I mean, you wouldn't be traveling at that speed. You'd want to know that you have a proper footing and that there's structure underneath you when you're traveling.
Yeah, I still say what they did, though. This is my personal opinion. What they did was, again, you're going to do it the easiest way possible. They have the crane there, they have the rover, they have the LEM, they have everything there that they want. They have the lights above, tons of lights above that crane. They had the power station, they had a generator shack. I mean, good Lord, all they needed to do was stick one of those astronauts in the rover and then use a high-speed camera, slow it down, put it in the optical printer, drop a frame here, add a couple frames there, and then you have the rover going in nice slow motion, and it's going to make the sand or whatever coming out the back of it look real. It's going to still come out there at the proper speed that you want it to come out there. Well, you just have to do just one take of him going around in a circle, and that's it. Call it a day.
You forgot a couple of things, Robert. You forgot about the caterer, the beer truck, the pizza delivery guy, and of course the Playboy bunnies. These people had to be looked after. Don't forget, they were sequestered for anywhere between 12 and 16 months from their family when they're doing this training. Somebody would have had to entertain these boys. I mean, you just can't let them out so they can do a little media blurb or, some guy from the newspaper going to interview them or whatever. That's about all that was going on while they were there. The rest of the time, they were isolated from their families. Everything else was that secret.
I wonder if they had FBI follow them or CIA agents follow them around secretly when they were out on the town.
I think the only thing they were doing when they were doing all their practice and simulations and stuff like that they were fully sequestered to that. The only thing they were doing were jumping in those T-38s and flying, like if they needed to fly to a meeting back and forth between Houston or Florida or whatever, California.
Surely they had time off at some point.
No, they were sequestered for that length of time. I think Apollo 12, the documents, I think it's 16 months they were completely isolated from their families.
That's quite a long time.
The other interesting thing that it's hard to find is when they were doing different practices, they just didn't have set up one location at Flagstaff for doing the stuff. Apparently for Apollo 16, there's Cinder Lake, California, and there's an Air Force base right there. Right. And they actually flew in and set up a LEM and a rover because there's a very large crater there that was a very close replica of what they claimed was on the lunar surface for Apollo 16. They were probably saying, hey, we don't want to use the same simulation ground all the time. They were probably looking to set up in a different location to show some different stuff, except the soil wasn't a good enough quality there.
Just to put this, that's the David Bryant book that was referenced in the discussion. So if anybody wants to come back on that, we've got that here. Plus the space flight thing. That's the point you mentioned. The guys who buy these things, was it the flag, sold for $162,500. That flag.
Really?
Yeah. And that was the largest size American flag signed and certified by Michael Collins, Apollo 11. $162,500. That's a lot of money.
Listen, when this finally comes to the light, those people are going to be wanting their money back with interest.
Oh, yes.
I'm waiting to see if they're going to start selling off the diapers that they didn't use because they were flowing as well. Right?
Yeah. NEXUS Magazine. 2 types of people in the world. Those who read it and those who are about to. Great magazine. Great magazine. Great magazine. Great magazine. Great magazine.